13th, the May elections are incredibly important because if you lose an independent Senate, you will have absolutely no checks and balances. No checks and balances in governance in the Philippines. What does that mean? I think this is a critical moment in Philippine history. It's a moment where we decide to stand firm on the rights guaranteed by the Philippine Constitution, where we demand the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Because if we don't, frankly for me, I have no choice. But I think that you are seeing a precipitous death by 1,000 cuts of democracy as we know it.
Maria, of course, has been in the news. She has been arrested twice for the past 2 months.
Oh my God.
And of course, she's the CEO of Rappler. She's one of Time's Person of the Year for 2018. And again, one of Time's 100 most influential persons for 2019. So, wala nang masyadong keme-keme. Si Maria po ang ating panauhin.
Maraming salamat po. First of all, please let me apologize. We came from the Society of Journalists across town, and then it just took us so long. And thank you for waiting and for listening. I guess the only thing I'll just start with one thing, and I want to actually hear more about you and what you think, what you see, what it looks like from over here, right? This week, as you know, a Matrix, the movie resurfaced. No, there was a Matrix that was released by it first appeared in the Manila Times and written by the chairman emeritus, who also happens to be the man in charge of President Duterte's public relations internationally. On that same day, the presidential spokesman, Sal Panelo, then admitted that the source was President Duterte. Since then, Manila Times issued a statement corroborating that. Why is this interesting and important? Because for the first time, fantasies made a reality, and a test balloon is out, right? What is that? Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, which did a series of stories on the Duterte family's wealth. Very interesting, for example, that the law firm of his daughter and son-in-law has been doing business for 10 years but is not registered with the SEC. Lots of other things that are there. Very well done by PCIJ. Vera Files, which is one of, along with Rappler, is an accredited fact checker of Facebook. The real person that they focused on was Ellen Tordesillas, who is the president of Vera Files. CMFR, Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, and NUPL, and Rappler. We were all named in this fantasy land, the Matrix, and we're supposedly involved in a plot to oust Duterte. Again, I can only roll my eyes, and when I read it, I was like, I don't know what to think anymore. I keep saying I feel like Alice in Wonderland and the Mad Hatter is in charge, and all we have to do is to keep walking until we come out the other side, and hopefully the world is right side up. This is important because not only is it medyo nakakahiya sa buong mundo na merong ganito ang Pangulo natin and the presidential office. But also it seems like an escalation again of attacks on free press and on independent journalists. Along with me in that, and Ellen Tordesillas, is Sheila Coronel, who is the founder of PCIJ, and she lives in New York, and she's a dean in Columbia School of Journalism, right? So again, if you have been online, you would have seen this. I think one of the things I'm looking forward to is trying to figure out who can we hold accountable, and how can we get redress when you're repeatedly libeled, right? At the same time, without wanting to use libel laws, because this has been used against journalists forever. So we're thinking through that. Any suggestions, any ideas would be great. And then the other thing is also to alert you that 2 or 3 weeks ago, Rappler's journalists and the organization filed a case at the Supreme Court, a press freedom case. It is to test whether or not the Supreme Court stands by the principles of the Constitution, stands by the Bill of Rights. For 14 months, Pia Ranada, our reporter, has been banned from the palace. And then following months, our reporters have been banned from any event that President Duterte goes to. So it's a roving ban. And then just what really triggered us to file the case and test our own judiciary is when one of our reporters was prevented from covering a campaign rally because President Duterte was there. So I think this is a critical moment in Philippine history. It's a moment where we decide to stand firm on the rights guaranteed by the Philippine Constitution, where we demand the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Because if we don't, frankly for me, I have no choice. But I think that you are seeing a precipitous death by 1,000 cuts of democracy as we know it. And it's time for us to stand up and say, we want the Constitution. This must be protected. We demand accountability and an end to impunity. Having said that, I guess I'd love to hear what you think, what you see, and answer any questions you may have.
Don.
Maria, question.
Don
At this
first.
time,
And then
so who's
Troy.
doing the checks and balance right now sa Presidente? I mean, is there an independent body or a non-partisan, body of government who's actually doing the checks and balance?
As of now, unlike the United States, right, Presidents Trump and Duterte have very similar styles, but the institutions in the United States are holding stronger. Our institutions in the Philippines have crumbled in so many instances. These cases, I've faced 11 cases. I've posted bail 8 times. I've paid more in bail than convicted plunderers. I would say that President Duterte is the most powerful man, perhaps even more powerful than Ferdinand Marcos was. He controls Congress, he controls the executive, and the one independent body that has pushed back has been the Senate. But the May 13th, the May elections are incredibly important because if you lose an independent Senate, you will have absolutely no checks and balances in governance in the Philippines. What does that mean? That could mean, for example, remember that there's a draft constitution that was passed through the House. The Senate already warned the House that if they sent that to the Senate, that it would be dead on arrival, right? If we have an administration-dominated Senate, if it is not an independent Senate, most likely we'll see before the end of the year a new constitution, perhaps a new form of, and I'm going to put in quotes, democracy, perhaps extension of term limits. We know what the draft looked like. We know that the transition committee is going to be named, all of them named by President Duterte. So again, I think this is a transformative moment, right? Do we want to maintain the democracy we have, imperfect though it may seem, or do we want to usher in a new era, or back to the future, if you will, right?
To follow up, if there is such an independent body who's functioning as a checks and balance, what should they be investigating right now with President Duterte?
The drug war, number one. Impunity. I see impunity on 2 fronts, right? First is the drug war. That's huge. I mean, then of course what are our agreements with China? What is driving our foreign policy? I mean, but the other one that few people really talk about is the information operations that is trying to manipulate Filipinos. That is exponential lies. When you tell a lie 1,000,000 times, it becomes truth. And what you can see there is without the facts, how can we have a democracy? We can't have discourse. We cannot debate policy. We haven't really talked policy since the social media campaign machinery that helped elect President Duterte in May 2016. That was weaponized by July 2016. And the first targets were normal people who questioned the killings in the drug war. The second targets were reporters and news organizations. And the end goal of that, and this is very similar to what's happening in the United States. Timothy Snyder wrote a book on tyranny, right? If you look at this, if you say a lie, say it 1,000,000 times, then you tell everyone else. If you have the podium, if you have the loudest voice in the room, then you tell everyone else that it's the journalists who lie, it's your critics who lie. Then your population has absolutely no idea. You tear down credibility and trust of institutions, so that you are the loudest voice in the room. And in that case, you hold power. I think what this shows us is that information is power. And our information ecosystem, which lives on social media as its foundation right now, it's connected to groups like Manila Times and then connected to state media, right? This ecosystem is killing facts. And we need to go back to a fact-based information ecosystem so that we can have rule of law. And that's the last part, right? So who's supposed to be doing that? The judiciary, right? And I'm appealing to the men and women in the Philippine judiciary, especially those who touch our cases. I've called these cases ludicrous. The fact that you hold the power to decide. Stick to the spirit of the Constitution. Revive the spirit of Philippine democracy. This is something that's been handed to us. 33 years ago, Filipinos coined people power. What the heck? Where are we today?
The very idea of democratic institutions is that the legislative is independent from the executive as well as the judiciary. Part of the legislative power is the power to hold hearings, committee hearings, and that's a very powerful tool because Congress also has the power of the purse or the budget. However, when there is no perceived independence of the legislators and they are not using their committee power hearings or investigative powers to do this, then that's why there's a perception that there is no check and balance as against the president.
Yeah, kasi everybody's talking about Mueller, diba? So parang, if, for example, merong Robert Mueller of the Philippines, what should this independent counsel be investigating right now?
Well, obviously, among other things, it's the drug killings. Right now, there's no independent verification of how many have been killed, the reason they've been killed, because based on the data collated by Human Rights Watch, there's no verification from the cops or the police department on how a specific person is dead. So that's one of the most interesting things. And ang kadahilanan nito ay dahil ang karamihan ng namamatay sa sinatawag na drug war ay yung mahihirap. So napaka-importante na investigahan yan.
So for example, for some magical reason, nagkaroon ng independent counsel na non-partisan, hindi dilawan, hindi baka Duterte, na will investigate the president. Ano yung dapat investigahan?
First of all, the contracts with China. Those contracts are very important. We don't know what they contain. And from the example of the first contract to come into public view, there are collaterals given, the right for China to take over any resource in the Philippines. That's the first most important thing. The second, of course, is the extrajudicial killings. I'm sure somebody knows something. Yeah.
Well, I think that counsel should investigate if he's really acting only within his power, and he's not acting beyond his power, because it all should be independent. The executive power, the legislation, the Supreme Court, they should all be doing their responsibilities within their power, and should be independent with each other.
Everything. Look into financial records, look into elections, look into everything. just so that because it is very divisive in the Philippines as well as here in the United States politically, and I don't like throw people off of my Facebook feed, so I see every side, I see every argument pro and con for whichever side you happen to be on. And so for me, it's like, you know what, you need somebody completely impartial who has absolutely no stake anywhere to be able to investigate this as thoroughly and as without bias or loyalty. But do people like that exist in the Philippines?
That's a big question.
That's a question. It's a valid question.
Thank you so much.
I think we all know journalism is under attack globally. And the Mueller report shows you the efforts that were done by Russia in the United States. I haven't read the entire thing. I'm reading it on the plane, but the parts I've read collaborate what I see in the Philippines. And we've done some stories that show you how our information ecosystem. There's an American who is an RT Sputnik expert and is always on Iranian television, who is popping up in the Philippine media, right? And you do, because you've gotten in social media fights. Ninochka is a warrior on social, so this is a global problem because the social media platforms are global. So a lie told in one country pops up in the next instantaneously. Long answer to, I am really thankful to the international journalists who continue to shine the light on the Philippines in a world that has so many problems. I think part of the reason the Philippines matters is because we are a democracy that is fighting to stay a democracy, and we can win this battle. We are a cautionary tale for the United States. And I think that's the lesson for Americans, right? If you don't protect your rights, it can be taken away like that. But power and arrogance go hand in hand. And without checks and balances, we've seen the power grow. And now you're seeing, an inability to even take questions. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Governance isn't easy. It's difficult. There's checks and balances. I wish they spent as much time talking and thinking and consulting on the very complex issues that drive our world today. Climate change, for one, right? We're the third most disaster-prone nation in the world. We don't talk about these things anymore. What we see are really mundane insults on social media. We yell and scream at each other, and I'm not so sure what we accomplish with that. We are tearing our society apart, and we're going to need to rebuild. What will replace what we have, right? And I guess that's part of it. It's important to me that we're aware of that moment in time, that as we're tearing down things that we've fought so hard for, what will we replace it with, and how can we build for the future?
Yes, thank you, Maria. Let's hear from Troy.
What do you think? What can you say about the state of the nation?
I think, like the United States, we're disjointed. We're one of the countries where cheap armies on social media have rolled back democracy because we are confused. And then you add to that the algorithms of the social media platforms, which divide us. And you have a leader who is not just a populist, but is very macho and is at times, at best, he's sexist. At worst, he's misogynistic. And I use those words at the Time 100 because it describes not just President Duterte, but also President Trump. It took us so long to win rights back for women, to get the words that describe us, that give us some form of equality. Let's not lose it in a blink.
My question is, how do you keep a rapper keep objectivity in your reporting, given the injustices, the way they treat you and Rappler is? Because I think media, Rappler is a huge organization, institution, has the responsibility to inform the people in non-biased platform. So how do you balance that?
Thanks for the question, and I struggle with this all the time. First, objectivity doesn't exist, right? Even when I was with CNN, I actually used to say this. Don standing up has a very different view of us than me sitting down looking at you. If we were talking to someone in London by phone and we had blinders here and you were only describing what you see in front of you, you will be describing something completely different. Don would say there are 3 people sitting in front of him on mic, two bottles of water. I would say there's a bookshelf and folks in front. There's a great 2 cameras in front of me. That's not what he said, right? But those are different views of the same space. And that's always what's powered reporting. When I first joined CNN, I replaced a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male who was much taller than I was. And I was a Filipino American, which meant the reports coming from the Philippines to CNN had my lenses. Our lenses are there. I find that when we hear people talk about bias or non-bias, it often shows their own bias. I think what we have to do is replace the word objectivity with transparency, right? Be transparent. And my guiding light right now is I call a spade a spade. You know, and the fact that I've lived through many things that I wish I'd never lived through actually shows me how power can be abused and used to stop answering questions, how it can be used to attack. I am just a reporter. I'm just a journalist. And the fact that so many state resources are being thrown at me makes me truly wonder, what am I supposed to be finding that, what makes the state so afraid to have real critical questions? You asked, more. Do I have more support outside than inside the Philippines? I think we have a lot of support in the Philippines, but I think anyone who stands up has a lot to lose. Christiana Manpour, when I first was arrested, the first time I was arrested, she was one of the first to tweet support, right, on Twitter. And what we did is we took down the first 7,000 tweets. 2,000 of the first 7,000 tweets attacked Christian for supporting for supporting me. There are consequences to exercising free speech. So I will, it's these simplistic, in many ways, they're used as tools to manipulate. And I think we need to call it. We need to say that, when a pro-Duterte blogger talks about biased media, hello, right? They don't even make a distinction that what they're doing is propaganda. And what we do as journalists is that not only do we tell you what this guy says, we also tell you what she says and what Don sees. And then we say, well, in the 6th floor of the building, there are these many people and they're Filipino-American journalists. That's context. So I think journalists, this is a critical time for journalists. We have to not be afraid to embrace our mission, because our country needs the mission of journalism even more today than at any other time.
Thank you. Ambassador Reyes, thank you.
I read for Positively Filipino and whatever. How important do you think are the up-and-coming elections? And for example, should the opposition not make a dent? Where do we go from there? And in this case, is it only a dramatic event like the death of a political leader that would galvanize the Filipinos into action once again? Because even insults on the majority leader during the Holy Week are not enough to do anything to excite the population.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your question. I think that there's a lot at stake. I think that, most of the politicians have looked at the midterm elections, the May 13th elections, as just a stepping stone to the presidential elections. That is a huge miscalculation, because we may never get to the presidential elections if we lose an independent Senate. And some of the statistical surveys, SWS and Pulse Asia, actually show that not one, perhaps we may have a full administration slate coming into the Senate. What that means is anything can happen, right? Because the checks and balances will be gone. And for me, I simplify it in my head. A new constitution for the Philippines means a new system of governance. It means everything is off the table. What we know over the last 33 some odd years will fundamentally change. It won't look like it, but it'll be exactly what's happened over the last 3 years, which is, it's like, I'll go back, death by 1,000 cuts. If I cut you, you're bleeding and you keep going. But when you have 1,000 of these cuts and you're bleeding from 1,000 slices, you will at some point, you will die, right? So this is what we're seeing. There's a lot at stake in these elections. And that's part of the reason I'm going home now. Rappler is going to focus on it. We'll continue doing stories. And I hope what you're seeing as well with The Matrix is that the journalists are coming together. You know, it's time. I have a big mouth. I can't stop myself from talking. I think Filipinos have dealt with injustice for a long time, and we push to get rid of it. Ninachka, your novels and what you've lived through, right? This is my watch, so I'm not ducking, and Rappler will not duck. We need to move forward as a nation to do that. So please help.
That's yeah. No, I'm just clapping because that is a punchline for you. For me.
You're not. And you actually have a lot more leeway because you don't have to worry about your physical safety.
But I do have a question. You use this metaphor, death by
1,000 cuts.
This is a Chinese metaphor. And I've long wondered as to really the very fine plan that was implemented. It's not within our capability to do this kind of social engineering. So I'm like, who devised this plan?
I think we're watching it take place in front of us, right? So I look, again, I go, if you think information is power, right? I looked at geopolitical power. The information operations on social media, this is not homegrown. Mm-hmm. You know, Rappler, we drank the Kool-Aid of social media for social good. I know that it works. Social media can be used for social good. But I looked to Russian disinformation. I looked at the Ukraine and how they dealt with that. That's where we developed a database that we call the Shark Tank, so we can track how we're being manipulated. I think about it like this. Our democracy is being pushed back, and the geopolitical help is coming from Russia is B2C, right? You know what I mean? Like, they go directly to consumers, so they manipulate, and that's a playbook. It's a dictator's playbook that's happening in many countries around the world. And the first report that showed that is November 2017. Freedom House came out with a report. Most recently, you will see last year, RSF, the World Press Freedom Index, they talked about how hate is being used, right? They're using free speech to inspire hate, to target perceived enemies. So it's using free speech to stifle free speech. The end goal is to pound you to silence. That's B2C. But look at the deals that the government has signed with China. And I think there has to be far more transparency about this. There's a deal for video surveillance. So I say the Chinese to Philippine government, that's a transfer B2B, like business to business, right? And I think that we have a lot to do as reporters, as journalists, and the technology has made it harder because it's like it's an accelerator. It's like there's a fire burning already, but then we threw gasoline on it. And our people, we don't understand that we're being manipulated. They're real people on social media who believe the lies. And the lies on Facebook spread faster than the truth. So how can we have a healthy democracy with this? So is it, that's, at least that's the way I see it, and then what we see is our government kind of riffing. It's the best at information, the use of fear, the use of violence, not just in the real world, but also in the virtual world, right? Threats.
Let's hear from Jessica, Miss Jessica Hagedorn.
Hello, Jessica! Oh my gosh!
Thank you for your bravery, indeed. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Piggybacking off of what Luis was asking about institutions and how they're helping or hindering in the Philippines. I haven't been back since 2015, so, forgive me if this is stuff everybody already knows, but I'm thinking about the Marcos years and how the artists and the writers and the intellectuals were the, voices of dissent. For whatever reasons, that happens. But are you seeing any of that kind of movement in the communities back in the Philippines of trying to respond in spite of the terror? And because that can be so powerful, and it seems like sometimes turmoil brings out the best in the artists and in the intellectuals and in the poets and.
I mean, no, thank you for the question. I think part of our problem is that the problem has not been articulated well enough, and the disinformation that comes out, the way Facebook has been weaponized, the social media has been weaponized, really leaves us in these echo chambers, and we think it's just a personal, I'm pro or anti. It isn't that, right? So I think this is the lesson I learned from the Time 100 dinner. We need the artists. We need to be inspired to get over the fear, right? That room that night was so interesting to me because the artists were looking for meaning and impact. And the leaders in the real world, Nancy Pelosi was on the other side, Jared Kushner was on the other side. They were looking for what artists bring, which is, in order to move beyond this, in order to be able to pull our democracy back, you're going to need to believe that it is possible, number one, and you're going to need to be inspired to move away from the fear and to build communities of action. I use that phrase because that's actually the way we set up Rappler. In 2012, if you ask me what Rappler is, we build communities of action, and the journalism is the food that we feed our communities. We need to be inspired. I mean, when your leader threatens or denigrates or pounds or threatens, something needs to pull the society together. Who will that be? And what I learned from Time 100 is that, art inspires. Art gives hope. So have we seen this in the Philippines? Yes, but let's look at what happened to Jim Paredes. Apo Hiking Society was a great force in the Marcos years, but then he's been extremely vocal. But look at how granular they went. Jim Paredes is an artist who had his voice, and what they did, and I will say they as who found something that would shame him to silence. And Jim, you shouldn't be shamed into silence. We need your voice, right? So that is the granular level. The end goal is to stifle your voice, to kill voices that will challenge. And how do we ask Filipinos to have courage? It's the artists. It is the artists. So that was my takeaway this time around. I think this moment in time, I wish it wasn't me, but when Rappler came under attack, I almost feel like I spent my entire career to train for this moment, right? I mean, it's not as if I went through 20 years with CNN. I went through war zone training. I've gone through, and I know how to get my people in and out of difficult situations. I went through ABS-CBN. My values and my principles are very clear. I know what our role is in society. So when it was clear that it was coming at us and the cases were filed, I'm not a wilting violet. I'm not going to duck. I don't think silence, guys, is consent. Silence is the enemy of democracy, right? Who is it? The Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. So I always say we shine the light. We shine the light. And if it's happening to me, I will tell you everything that is happening to me. So all I do is I call a spade a spade. Time was amazing in the sense that it gave a level of safety for me and for Rappler. You know, they didn't tell me that I was Person of the Year, that they named me one of the guardians. I found out on Twitter at 6:30 at night on the day that I posted bail 4 times in the morning. And then, you know, we were just trying to figure out, you know, what do we do? And then that night, the first tweet, and when I saw it cross, I sent it to our social media head because I thought it was fake. So I guess the last part that it's funny because we descend to insults, you know, and it makes me very sad for the top office in the land when instead of policy and leadership, we get insults and curses. This isn't the way I want my nation to appear on a global stage. Filipinos have a lot to offer, and we need leaders.
Thank you. This should be our last question. I'm sorry, Attorney Lara, please.
It may sound like a fight, but do you have like a best case scenario post-May elections? Do you already know the worst that can happen?
Sure. Thank you for asking. So we will end on a note of hope. I think the best case scenario is that Filipinos, guns, goons, and gold will not win. Right? This is the way we characterize 1986.
Yeah.
Guns, goons, and gold. Right? And my best case scenario is that in the May elections, all of those will fail. And that means, right?
Best case scenario.
And that somehow we wake up and find our voices, and the people with a lot to risk. Because actually, this is always what happened. We know this from 1986. The business community will be last. But the revolt is, oh my gosh, I better not use that word. Scratch that. These are individual battles for integrity. Each Filipino has to fight that. And that is my best case scenario. That we win that Filipino values stand strong, and we elect the government we deserve.
You made my day. You made my day. You made my day. Oh, day. You made my day. You made my day. You made my day. Oh, day.